In September of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood inside the most powerful city he had ever taken. Moscow was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, and large parts of the city were already burning as thick smoke filled the sky. He had crossed half of Europe with the largest army the world had ever seen, and in his mind, this moment was supposed to mark the end of the war, the final confirmation that no force on the continent could resist him. Napoleon had won almost every campaign of his life. He defeated kings, crushed coalitions, and forced entire empires to surrender, often in a matter of months, and over time, this success shaped how he understood war. One pattern had always repeated itself. When a capital city falls, negotiations follow soon after, because political power collapses once the symbol of authority is taken. Napoleon trusted this rule deeply, because it had never failed him before, and success had trained him to believe that history repeated itself for those who understood it. What he did not understand was that Russia was not playing by the same rules. Napoleon was not reckless or impulsive. He was a strategist who believed in logic, systems, and predictability. He studied history, relied on patterns, and trusted that human behavior remained consistent under pressure. For years, his enemies had behaved the same way again and again, defending their capitals, protecting their populations, and negotiating once defeat became obvious. Napoleon believed war could be solved like a problem, as long as enough pressure was applied at the right place and long enough. For him, Moscow was that place. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with more than 600,000 soldiers, the largest army the world had ever seen. This was not meant to become a long or exhausting war, because Napoleon's plan was simple: force the Russian Emperor Tsar Alexander I into a peace agreement quickly, end the conflict in one campaign, and return to Europe before winter arrived. Everything about the invasion was designed for speed, not endurance, and Napoleon assumed the Russians would eventually be forced to fight on his terms. But the Russian leadership thought very differently. Russia was effectively guided by Tsar Alexander I, but the military strategy was shaped by generals who understood one brutal truth: they could not defeat Napoleon in a single decisive battle. Instead of protecting cities, Russian forces retreated deeper into the country, destroying villages, burning crops, and leaving nothing useful behind. This strategy, later known as scorched earth, was designed to starve Napoleon's army without fighting it directly, forcing him to march further and further away from safety, while time itself became the weapon. Napoleon kept winning battles, but every victory pushed him deeper into hostile territory, stretching supply lines across thousands of kilometers. By the time his army approached Moscow, soldiers were already exhausted, hungry, and mentally drained, even though Napoleon still believed one final move would end everything. Napoleon believed Moscow would change the situation completely, even though it was not Russia's political capital. St. Petersburg held the government, but Moscow carried enormous symbolic weight, representing history, identity, and national pride. Napoleon believed that no ruler could allow such a city to fall without surrendering soon after, because in Europe, losing a symbolic capital usually meant losing legitimacy in the eyes of both allies and enemies. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he expected negotiations, officials, and formal surrender. Instead, he found emptiness. Most of the population had fled, and within hours, fires broke out across the city, spreading uncontrollably through wooden neighborhoods. Napoleon watched Moscow burn from the Kremlin and interpreted the destruction as desperation, believing the Russian emperor would now have no choice but to respond, because the loss appeared too great to ignore. But Russia remained silent. Days passed, then weeks, and no message arrived. No diplomats came, no peace talks began, and Moscow slowly turned into a blackened, frozen shell. Behind the scenes, Napoleon's generals began to report worsening conditions, rising desertion, collapsing discipline, and soldiers who no longer believed they were marching toward victory. Some officers quietly warned that the army was bleeding strength every day without fighting a real enemy. But Napoleon had heard warnings before, and in the past, those warnings had always been proven wrong. Napoleon trusted numbers, reports, and experience more than fear or intuition. His intelligence system was built for fast European wars, not for a vast country where enemies refused to confront him directly. Reports reaching him were often delayed, incomplete, or overly optimistic, and Napoleon assumed the situation could still be controlled if he waited long enough for Russia to make the first move. Another problem was the army itself. Napoleon's Grand Army was not a single unified force, but a collection of soldiers from many different countries, including France, Poland, Italy, Germany, and former rival states. Many of these men had no personal reason to fight in Russia, and once the campaign stalled, loyalty weakened quickly. Hunger and cold erased discipline faster than any enemy attack, and survival began to matter more than victory. Napoleon now faced a decision that would define not only the campaign, but his entire legacy. He could leave Moscow early, retreat while his army still had strength, and attempt to save what remained of his forces, or he could stay, wait, and force Russia to surrender, believing time would eventually work in his favor. Leaving without a peace agreement felt like failure, and Napoleon feared that retreat would damage his reputation across Europe, encouraging enemies to rise against him. So Napoleon chose to stay. What he failed to understand was that Russia's leadership had already accepted the destruction of Moscow as the price of victory. For Russia, this war was no longer about cities or negotiations, but about endurance and sacrifice. They were willing to lose land, people, and history if it meant destroying Napoleon's army slowly, without giving him the decisive moment he desperately wanted. Winter arrived faster than Napoleon expected. Temperatures dropped sharply, food supplies disappeared, and disease spread through the army. Soldiers were no longer fighting battles. They were fighting hunger, exhaustion, and cold, while morale collapsed and desperation replaced confidence. Even when advisors urged Napoleon to retreat, he hesitated, because admitting the need to leave meant admitting that his logic, which had built an empire, had finally failed. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow, the situation was already beyond repair. Snow covered the roads, supply lines were gone, and Russian forces attacked constantly, targeting the weakest and slowest units. Thousands of soldiers died every day, not from combat, but from freezing temperatures and starvation, as men froze where they stood and horses collapsed, blocking the roads behind them. Out of more than 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. Napoleon's greatest army was destroyed without a final decisive battle, and the myth of his invincibility was shattered. European nations that once feared him now saw vulnerability, and within 3 years, Napoleon would lose his empire, followed soon after by his freedom. Napoleon did not fail because he lacked intelligence or courage. He failed because he trusted past victories too much and believed the rules of war would never change. Russia proved that sometimes refusing to surrender, even at unimaginable cost, is more powerful than fighting. The lesson of Moscow is simple and brutal. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is not attacking, not retreating, but waiting just a little too long. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more.